speaking of college football, let's bring in our guy down there in sunny Las Vegas, Brad Powers. Brad, how you making out?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me on as always.
Yes, sir. Okay, great show so far. Let's keep on rolling here. So we got 4 games to discuss. If you missed Brad on Monday's show, he gave out USC -6.5. That's now up to the key number of 7. That's why you want to get in on some of these bets early. And also Penn State, Ohio State under 47. Once again, you missed the best of the number, most likely. That is now down to 45.5. So let's touch on a couple more best bets here, Brad. Then we'll look into some of the bigger games of the weekend. Let's take a look at this Florida Atlantic 3-point spread. They're taking on UTSA, the Road Runners. Do you like the favorite or do you like the underdog in this game?
Yeah, I like the underdog, Florida Atlantic plus the 3 here, the home underdog, and a couple reasons. Number one, I think UTSA is off a couple of phony finals. Looks like they've controlled matters against their last 2 opponents, Temple and UAB. But the reality is they were outgained in both of those games, benefited from a +2 turnover differential margin in both of those games. So a couple of phony finals says to me that UTSA is a little overrated. And then on the other side, Florida Atlantic, I think the light bulb came on for first-year coach Tom Herman. Off the bye, that they've shaped up quite a bit, beating Tulsa and blowing out South Florida last week. They're doing it in a variety of ways through the run game and also the pass game last week. And then also they're getting pressure on the quarterback with 12 sacks their last 3 games. So this to me, when you look, keep it simple, better team in yards per play margin, better team in yards per game margin, playing a tougher schedule. This is a case where I like that we're getting the home underdog here +3.
Okay, next up, let's take a look at the Appalachian State Old Dominion, total of 53.5. You think this is going to be a fun one?
Yeah, well, at least funner than what the odds makers are making it out to be. We're going to go over the total here. So I know normally you don't think high scoring with App State, but the reality is both Old Dominion and App State are in the top 20 in the country in terms of tempo. So when you got a total of 53.5, you got 2 teams that run a lot of tempo. That screams value to me. So why is this total only sitting here in the low 50s? Well, both teams that have had a few games this year that have been impacted greatly by weather, including an Old Dominion game against Texas A&M Commerce, where it was a 10-9 game played, an absolute slop. That's kind of suppressing the 2 team scoring averages this year. And that, to me, has given us some value here on the over 53.5.
Okay, let's get into some of these big games here. Let us start with Alabama Tennessee, a big rematch from last year. The total for this one is at 48.5 points. So what are you thinking here, over or under that number?
Yeah, when you think just back to last year's game, which was one of the better games of recent college football history, high scoring game, not going to be the case in my opinion this year. We're going under this total because if you ask me what teams' units have the advantage over the other, and it's both teams' defenses in this instance. Let's talk Tennessee. What does Tennessee do best defensively? Get after the quarterback. Well, what is Alabama's weakness on offense? Failing to protect Jalen Milroe. They've given up at least 4 sacks in each of their last 5 games, and I expect more of the same this week in that regard. On the other side of the ball, it's become well apparent now that Joe Milton, the quarterback for Tennessee, is a significant downgrade from what they had on offense last year with Hendon Hooker. So I don't expect Tennessee's offense to have success against this Alabama defense. And their best play last week against A&M was a punt return touchdown that kind of inflated their scoring. So under 48.5 for me here.
Okay, let's wrap things up with Florida State and Duke. Florida State favored by 14.5 points. You think they can cover that number?
Yeah, it seems like a big spread, but I don't think it's going to be the case in this instance. And I'm finding value because Mike Elko, the head coach for Duke, came out yesterday and said, he thinks there's a good chance that their quarterback, Riley Leonard's going to play. What did the market do? Well, it reacted immediately to that news, and the line went from 14 down to 13.5. And then we saw the big money come in. Lots of buy prices at 13.5 all the way through that key number. Riley Leonard's not going to play for Duke off that high ankle sprain. He's only a few weeks removed from that. And you got a backup quarterback that, yeah, Duke won last week 24-3, but it wasn't because of the offense. It was because of the defense. They're really up against it here on the road against a very well-rested Florida State team looking to extend margin here. So Florida State for me minus 14.5.
Okay, quick question for you here,
Yep.
Brad. Handicapping tips, if you want to call it that. So, when I'm handicapping the NFL, the stats that I probably value the most, I look at yards per play, how both the offense and defense perform on third down, and in the red zone. Some people might call those stats kind of basic. I don't get too heavily into the DVOAs and the EPAs, things of that nature. So, when you're handicapping college football, what stats do you value the most?
Great question. I try to keep it simple. I mean, I'm trying to incorporate more of the analytics, the EPAs and whatnot. But I mean, I think college football with 133 teams, sometimes it's easier just to keep it simple. So yards per play, margin. I'm always looking for margin. Yards per game margin, points per game margin, and I think most important that the market and even the analytics people do not grasp is strength of schedule because there's such disparity. And yes, you can have great stats or you can have horrific stats. It's all dependent on who you played and how tough or weak those opponents are. So I think the most important stat is strength of schedule in college football, especially when you get into conference play, because the disparity between the non-conference schedules is so great.
Okay, so one other question that's it's not rare in college football where you see spreads of 20, 30, sometimes 40 points or more. So, what factors do you consider when considering if that favorite can win by margin? Sometimes in the NFL, I just look and say, hey, this team has a history of playing up to the competition. This team has a history of playing down to the competition. The Kansas City Chiefs sometimes let teams hang around. But what do you consider with these gigantic spreads in college football?
Well, I'm on the wrong side of 40 now, it's tough to get into the thought processes and minds of these college kids. I don't like to always do motivation anymore like I did maybe even 10 years ago. But I will say this, a couple things I look for is tempo. Does the big favorite run a lot of tempo? Because if that's the case, I'm more prone to be laying it just because there's more plays, more possessions, more opportunities for the stronger team to exert their will over the weaker competition. If they run a slow tempo, like a Michigan or a Georgia, we saw them with big point spreads struggle at least early in the year covering those big point spreads because they're running slow tempo. So that'd be number one. And then, maybe I will get into a little bit the motivation for margin. Did this big underdog beat them last year as far as the series history? Like you mentioned, does this team have, trouble as far as covering big point spreads in the past? Or, you got to basically look at it. Do they have something looking ahead, a big game that maybe they're resting starters in the second half because of a big game on deck?
Okay, one last question here from the chat. Matthew Wingham. I don't know if he asked a similar version of this question the other day, but we'll touch on it again. So, Brad, thoughts on Penn State, Ohio State under the current number is 45.5, or would you consider looking at a team total under instead? Any thoughts, I guess, on the game under or team total under in that game?
I'm still leaning more towards the under there. I mean, it was best bet material because I thought it was off like 3 points. I made it 44, so I still would lean under. Team total, if you're going to get involved in one, I'm more on the Penn State team total under. I trust Ohio State at home more than a young quarterback on the road making his first big time road start.
Okay, there we have it. Matthew, thank you very much for the question. Okay, Brad, that does it. Thanks again for joining us. Best of luck with your bets this weekend, and we will catch you again on Monday's show.
Thanks for having me.